Today we will make a simple forest in Unreal Engine 5.2 using the new PCG features. We can cut a path through the forest, adjust the shape and size of the forest using splines, and we can make it big. And we are not just limited to trees. We can use any static mesh that we want to, like I did with this toy car and this toy zebra here. So let's get started. Let's create a new project in Unreal Engine 5.2. From games, I will select the blank template and let's name our project Forest PCG. Now we need to enable a few plugins. Under Edit, Plugins, let's look for Procedural. And let's restart the engine. Now in the content drawer, if we right click, we can see this PCG here. Let's create a new PCG graph and let's call it Forest PCG. Let's double click to open it. Now this is a PCG graph and we can see these nodes here and also a few pins. We can use this landscape to get the surface data of the landscape and get some points on it. So to get some points on the landscape surface, let's use a surface sampler. Connect the landscape to the surface. You can play around with these settings and see what looks good for you. For now, I'm going to keep the defaults. And on any nodes here, if we select the nodes and hit the E key on our keyboard, if we select the node and hit the E key, we can disable or enable nodes. And also if we hit the D key on our keyboard, we can debug it. So with the D key, let's debug it and let's drop this graph on our level. So we can see these points in debug mode. So you can also add a density filter. This will filter out some of the points and adjust the density according to our settings. So if we hit the D key here with this selected, we can see lesser points than before. You can play around with these settings as well and see what looks good for you. For now, I'm going to use the defaults. We can also use a transform points node. So this node is useful for adding some variations like adding random rotation and random scales to our points. So in rotation max here, for the Z, I will enter 360. And for the scale min, let's say 0.6. Now we select this node and hit the D key. We can see that our points look like this. And there is a node for spawning static meshes. Static mesh spawner. We can use it to add static meshes to our PCG. Before we add the meshes, let's get our assets. I'm going to use this vegetation spruce forest asset from Project Nature in Unreal Engine Marketplace. It is available for free as of now. So we can click add to project. And you might have to check this show all projects and enter the name of your project. Then you can select your project. And if the assets have not been updated for the version of the engine that you're using, you can click here and select a different version. And then we can click add to project. And after the assets are added to your project, you can use them. So by selecting this node and adding some mesh entries in the descriptor in static mesh, we can select the asset that we want. So let's look for the assets that we just added. So for this one, I'm going to use this spruce half 01 low. And let's also click this little icon to go to this asset in our browser. And let's right click here and enable nanite. So enabling nanite can help with performance. Now let's do the same for the second mesh. So I will look for spruce and I will use this one, spruce half 04 low. And let's click this little icon to go to this asset in our content browser. And let's enable nanite on this. And you can also play around with these weights. For example, for this mesh, if I say the weight is 2, this will be spawned twice as many times as this one. Let's connect the output. If we go back to our level, we can see that we have these trees. In the outliner, we can select our PCG and press R to scale. Let's make it bigger. So for now, this is how it is looking. Now let's go back to our forest PCG, and in this surface sampler, if we check this unbounded and go back to our level, we can see that we have so many trees. So this is a very large procedurally generated forest here that you can see on the screen. Unreal Engine's procedural generation abilities, even in the early stages, are amazing. But let's disable it. Disable the unbounded. For now, we just want a small forest. Also, for a very large forest, your trees must be very optimized and very performant. We can click on any asset in the outliner or any actor in the outliner and press F to focus on it. Now we want to cut a path through this small forest that we have. We want to cut a path through this using a spline. Let's add that ability. So in the content drawer, back in our content folder, let's add a new actor. I'll call it BP path. Let's double click to open it. And with this actor selected, let's add a tag in the details. So let's look for tags, and I will add a new tag here. Let's say this is path, and let's add a new component. I will add a spline component, and with this spline component selected, let's enable this scale visualization width, and also let's select this point and drag it a bit further. Compile, save, and let's add the path to our level. So we can select this point. We can hold Alt key on our keyboard and drag to add a new point to the spline. Now we want to make sure that around this spline there are no trees. So let's go back to our PCG and let's add a node here. Get spline data. Here we need to select the actor. We will choose all world actors by tag, and the actor selection tag is the one that we added to our spline. That is path. Now we need a spline sampler. Let's connect it to the sampler, and we also need a bounce modifier. So this will get us points on the spline, and this will modify the bounce of the points. So this will make sure that there is some space around our points. In the details here of this node, let's change these. I'll say 200, and we will only change the Y and Z values. Now we want to subtract these points from these points. So you want to subtract the path spline points from the landscape surface points that we're using. For that, we can use a difference node, and we need to do it before we apply any filters or transformation. We can hold Alt and click on a connection to break it. Let's connect the difference to the density filter and the surface sampler of the landscape to the source, and the bounce modifier of the path spline to the differences. Now let's go back to our level. We can see that very easily we can cut a path through the forest that we have. Let's make the forest a little bit bigger. Select the PCG and press R to scale. Now this is looking nice, and we are not just limited to forests or trees. We can actually use any mesh with this PCG that we want. So for example, I will add some new meshes. I will add Quixel content to our project. So here I will look for toy car. I will download the high quality one and add it. I've already downloaded it. I will add it. And let's also add a toy zebra. I have downloaded the high quality one and I will add this. Now back in our PCG graph, if we select the static mesh spawner and change the meshes, these will be too small. So let's modify the scale of this by the transform points node. So in the scale, let's set these to 20, 20. 20 for the max and 20 for the min. Let's go back to our level. Now we can see that we have a large collection of these toys. Isn't this amazing? So PCG is not just limited to forest or trees. You can use it for basically any meshes that you want to. And if you move the path, it will automatically adjust. Let's try that. Select the path, and if we move it, we can see that this procedurally generated forest of toys is automatically adjusting. This is very nice. For now, I will undo this. So back in our PCG graph, in the transform points, let's set the scale min to 0.6 and max to 1. So either you can type 1 or click this undo icon here, little undo icon here. And in the spawner, static mesh spawner, let's select the meshes for our trees. Now with these trees, one more thing is if we make them unbounded again and go back to our level, and if we go to some steep area that has some angle, so I will hide our PCG for now and select a steep angle, press F to focus. Now we're near here, let's go closer. So this is a good spot. And if I enable the PCG again by clicking this little eye icon, we can see that on these slopes, these trees are growing at an angle. Now, if we do not want that and we want the trees to be growing straight, let's go back to our PCG graph. And in the transform points node, let's check this absolute rotation. And if we go back to our level, we can see that even on the slopes, these trees are growing straight. Let's just turn off the unbounded again. And back in our level, select the forest PCG, press F to focus. So what if we want to change the shape of our forest using a spline? Let's add that ability as well. In the content drawer, let's add another actor. I will call it BP shape. Let's double click to open it. And with the actor selected here, with the self selected, let's add a tag. And I will add a new tag. I will call it shape. And let's add a spline component here. With this spline selected, let's check closed loop. Our shape will be a closed loop. It is very important for our shape to be a closed loop. Let's select this point and drag to make it a little bit longer. And hold Alt key on your keyboard and drag to duplicate the point. Again, hold the Alt key and drag. For now, this is fine. We can adjust the shape later in our level. Compile, save, and let's add this spline to our level. So one more point about splines is it's probably better to select the points and change the shape instead of using the resize tool to make the spline larger. So for example, if I press R, it's probably better to not do this. It's probably better to not resize the spline using this resize tool with this PCG at least, because sometimes it can cause problems. So let's press W again. So we do not want these trees to be growing outside the PCG, and we also do not want these trees to be growing outside this spline. So for that, we will use intersection node. Let's go back to our PCG and let's use an intersection node. Before that, let's also get the spline data. Let's select the spline, old world actors, and the tag that we added is shape. Let's use the spline sampler. With the spline sampler selected, dimension, let's select on interior, because we want the points inside our spline. And for this to work, the spline must be a closed loop. And also let's change this interior sampling space. I will use 500. So this will add some space between our points in the spline. Also let's check this project onto surface and let's connect it to intersection. Also let's connect the landscape surface to the intersection. Then we can connect the intersection to difference. And we can hold Alt and delete the previous connection. So let's go back and see if it works. Yeah, it is working, but these are a little bit not dense enough. So let's change some values. The spline sampler, let's say 300. This is better. So we can select the point and move it to change the shape of our spline. We can also add more points by holding Alt and dragging. So this is how we can change the shape of our small forest. Again, it is probably better to not scale the spline using the resize tool. If we want to change the size of our spline with these PCGs, if you want to do that, it's probably better to just drag these points and change the size of the spline. And one more point is, if this is not working for you, you can select the shape, and if it is not working for you, maybe the shape probably spawns somewhere like here, and we want the shape to spawn on the surface, on the ground. So you can select the shape actor and focus on the viewport, move it a bit, and then press the end key on the keyboard. So this will snap the actor to the floor. Now there's one more question. What if we want more than one path through the forest? For example, if we want to have two paths. So let's select the BP path actor here and hold the Alt key on a keyboard to duplicate the actor. So by holding the Alt key, if we drag, we have one more path, but as we can see, it is not working. So back in our PCG graph, when we get the data of the spline, let's check this, select multiple. So back in our level, we can see right now this is working, and the PCG is adjusting automatically to the changes that we make. Sometimes if checking this select multiple is not working, adding a union after the sampler can work. So for example, we can select this sampler node and we can add a union node right after this and break the previous connection, connect it to the bounce modifier. So doing that might work, but I'm not going to do that since it is working normally for me. So we can use Ctrl Z to undo. And then one more question is, what if we want more than one such shapes in our forest? So for example, if we increase the size of this, if we select the forest PCG, press R to scale and increase the size of it. Press W to move. Let's say we want one more shape here. So let's add the shape. Also, sometimes if you use this and the point goes in the upwards direction, you can maybe undo it, or you can right click, select spline points, select all spline points, and then you can right click again and snap align, snap to floor. So that is also useful. Now we can see that the trees are not spawning here. Let's go back to our PCG graph and get spline data. In the get spline data for the shape, we can check this, select multiple, and back in our level. So sometimes it does not work. So maybe the plugin still needs more improvements, or maybe I'm using it wrong. But to fix it, so first we want to disable this density filter. Select the density filter node and press E to disable it. And even now it is not working. We will go back to our PCG graph. We will keep the density filter off. And after this spline sampler, we will add a union node. Break the previous connection and connect the union to the intersection. So back in our level, we can see that right now it is working. If this is a bit too dense, we can go back to our graph and in this sampler, let's change it from 300 to 500 again. Now with these splines, with these unions, I do not like to use this density filter, but we can probably use it. So if we enable it, you can see there are no trees, and if we play around with the values of this, so if we decrease the lower bound and upper bound, go back to the level, we can see there are a few trees. Decrease again or increase the upper bound. So we can play around with these values and see how it works. For now, I'm going to keep it to defaults and disable it. By pressing E, I will disable it. So back in our level, we can see that multiple paths are working and multiple shapes are also working. And this is adjusting automatically to the changes. Now, one more question is, what if we do not want to use a landscape? What if we want to use a different static mesh actor, for example? So to make it work with that, I will add a new level here. Let's double click to open it, save selected. From the window, environment line mixture, let's add all of these lights. and I will add a basic cube, and let's scale it by pressing R key on our keyboard and dragging. We can scale it. We will use this floor as our ground. Press W again, and with this cube selected, let's look for tags here. Under the actor tags, I will add a new tag. Let's say this is ground. Now we want to make a new procedural graph for this type of setup. So let's duplicate this forest PCG, and let's say forest PCG 2. This will be for our level that does not have a landscape. Let's double click to open it, and here let's disconnect it by pressing Alt and clicking. We will disconnect the landscape from the surface sampler. Now here we want to use a node called get actor data, and again here in actor filter, let's select all world actors by tag, and this will be the tag that we just added, so it will be ground. And let's connect this to the sampler. Now let's go back to our level, and if we drop the new PCG here for PCG 2, we can see that it is working. Now if this is a bit too dense, in the forest PCG 2 and select the surface sampler, let's modify these point extents. Now we can see that it is a bit less dense. And again, let's add our shape here. Let's undo that. And let's adjust the shape. Also, let's resize our PCG here and move it. And if you want to cut a path through this, select the path, and if we move it, we can see that it is adjusting. And if we add one more path, so if we hold Alt key and drag to add one more path, so multiple paths are also working here. And if we drag one more shape, so multiple shapes are also working with the setup as well. So that is how we can use this PCG without a landscape if you want to. Now let's go back to the original level. Now there is one more question. How can we change the values of this procedural graph, or how can we adjust it according to a particular actor? So for example, if we go back to our PCG graph, so if we want to modify these point extents, for example, and if we want to make these trees less dense or more dense, and if we want to check the unbounded here, or if we do not want to check that, and we want to do that differently for a particular level or a particular actor, so how do we do that? So let's see how to do that. So first, before doing any of that, in the outliner, let's delete this PCG here, because now our forest will not be just a simple PCG graph, it will be a blueprint actor. So let's make a new blueprint actor. I'll call it BP forest. Let's double click to open it. And yeah, in the level, we can keep these paths and splines here, as these are not really a part of that PCG. So we can keep it in the level. Now in our BP forest actor here, in the event graph, let's add a few variables. So first we want to add a boolean unbounded. So this will decide if our PCG is unbounded or not. Compile, and by default it is false, that is fine. And let's click this little eye icon to expose it to the blueprints. And let's go back to the forest PCG here. We can close it. Let's close this one, and all of these. Now for this surface sampler, we want this value to come from the blueprint. We can expand this and hover over this point extends, and we can see that this is a vector. So let's go back to the blueprint and add a new variable here. Let's say this is extends, point extends, and the type will be vector. And by default, let's say this will be 200. Compile, save. And back in our PCG graph, in this spline sampler, we also want this interior sample spacing value to come from the blueprint. Let's close this one, and let's close this one as well. Let's see what is the type of that variable. So interior sample spacing, and the type is float. So let's add a float. So back in our actor blueprint, let's add a new variable. We'll call it interior sample spacing, and the type is float. And by default, let's say 500. Compile, save. And for these variables, let's click this little eye icon. And also let's add a new component here. Let's look for PCG component. And with this component selected, let's select the graph that we're using. So it will be this one. Compile, save. Also in the viewport, we need to add some bounds to this. So to do that, let's look for box collision. And let's increase the size of this box collision. So here in box extent, I will say 2000. Compile, save. And back in our level, let's drag and drop our forest actor here. And let's increase the size of it. Press R and increase the size. Our forest actor is actually working, but it is not yet getting the values from the blueprint. So let's go back to our PCG graph and let's use a node get actor property. We need 3 of these. So first we will need for the interior sample spacing. So let's connect that here. And with this node selected, let's change the property name to interior sample spacing exactly as we typed the name of the variable inside our blueprint. So this should be exactly like we typed it here. We can even select this, press F2 and copy this and paste the name here. Let's collapse it. Now let's add one more node, get actor property, and this will be unbounded. Let's connect it to the unbounded here. And let's again get actor property. This will be point extents. And let's connect it to the point extents. Let's collapse it. Now let's save it and go back to our level. Now we can see that it is actually working and it is getting these values from our blueprint. So if we select the BP forest here, and in the details here, we can change these values. So for example, interior sample spacing, we can say 300. And we can see that these forests are getting more dense when we do that. And also we can change the point extents. Let's change it to 100. So this is probably too dense. Let's modify some other values as well. Interior sample spacing, let's change it to 500 again. So we can see that these values are being taken from the blueprint now. And also one more thing is if we make it unbounded here, if we select the BP forest here and we make it unbounded, it does not really become unbounded because we have these shapes here. So in this setup, if we want to make it unbounded, we will have to remove the shapes. So if we delete these shapes from this outliner, select the shape and delete it. And we select our forest again. And here if we select this PCG and click on generate, it will now generate unbounded forest. There are probably better ways to do this. Let's try to make it less dense. Select BP forest and change the point extents to back to its default value. That will be 200. It will take some time. Again, to make this unbounded forest, your trees and meshes must be extremely optimized and performant. Or maybe there are better ways to do this instead of using this PCG here. I will turn off the unbounded again. So select our forest and check off this unbounded. And let's add a shape. So this is how we can use the procedural generation features of Unreal Engine 5.2. And one more point is, if we make it unbounded and want to remove these shapes, or we just do not want to use these shapes here. So if we just delete these shapes and go back to our PCG, it is worth noting that this gives a warning. So it is giving a warning like no matching actor was found. But for my setup, it still works if I want it unbounded. But I do not really want this forest to be unbounded, so I will get back to shapes. And when the shapes are back, it does not give a warning here. Same for the paths. If we remove the paths and if we click this force region, so this path also gives a warning that no matching actor was found. So it's probably better to not delete the splines if we want to add this spline logic to our forest PCG. I will undo it for now.